Hey, friends! I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The invitation arrived on an ordinary afternoon, yet it carried with it the weight of a milestone she hadn't anticipated feeling so acutely. He had asked her to meet his parents, a gesture meant to signify trust, commitment, and the next step in their evolving relationship. But instead of feeling honored or excited, she was gripped by a sense of hesitation that she could not easily articulate. The idea of entering into the private world of his family, of exposing herself to scrutiny and navigating the subtle nuances of unfamiliar dynamics, stirred a quiet apprehension that made her chest tighten and her mind race with conflicting thoughts. She reflected on her own boundaries, the moments when social anxiety had dictated her behavior, and the internal voice that cautioned caution over impulsive engagement. In that instant, the invitation was no longer a simple request. It became a mirror reflecting her own insecurities, past experiences, and the subtle discomforts she carried with her into every relational interaction. She considered the possible outcomes: a smooth meeting that would solidify their connection, awkward encounters that might reveal differences she was unprepared to negotiate, or even the potential for missteps that could ripple into his perception of her and the trajectory of their bond. Each scenario spiraled in her mind, amplifying her uncertainty and the weight of decision making that seemed disproportionate to the actual event. She recognized that her hesitation was not merely about meeting his parents, but about exposing vulnerabilities she often kept carefully guarded, confronting the implicit expectations and social rituals that came with such encounters. In the quiet moments following the invitation, she examined her own motivations, realizing that fear of discomfort had overridden the desire to participate, that the comfort of avoidance had momentarily outweighed the significance of relational growth. She noted how easily human instinct can prioritize self-preservation, how subtle anxieties can transform ordinary requests into emotional dilemmas, and how the act of saying no can carry consequences far beyond the immediate context. Her reflections turned to him, his excitement, the care and intention behind the invitation, and the subtle ways in which it communicated not just a desire to connect with his family, but also trust in her willingness to engage fully in the relational journey. She began to grasp the disparity between his perception and her own internal hesitations, the quiet tension forming between expectation and avoidance. The chapter delved into the psychology of relational milestones, illustrating how moments designed to affirm commitment can, when met with reluctance, seed doubt and uncertainty. She recognized that this single decision, seemingly minor in the flow of everyday life, had the potential to influence his confidence in their future together, to color his perception of her willingness to embrace shared experiences, and to alter the emotional dynamics of their connection. Internally, she wrestled with competing priorities: the desire for comfort versus the recognition of relational significance, self-preservation versus vulnerability, and the tension between immediate relief and long-term consequence. Each thought, each imagined scenario magnified the stakes, transforming a simple invitation into a complex landscape of introspection, anticipation, and subtle anxiety. She examined patterns of avoidance she had carried from past relationships, noting how hesitation had once protected her from discomfort but had also limited her relational growth and created invisible barriers between herself and others. These insights were accompanied by an emerging awareness of responsibility, that her decisions, even in seemingly small matters, could reverberate emotionally, shaping the perceptions and confidence of those she cared for. As the day wore on, the tension did not dissipate but instead crystallized into a keen awareness of choice and consequence, illuminating the delicate interplay between personal boundaries and relational expectations. She understood that the invitation represented more than a social engagement. It was a test of willingness, trust, and alignment with shared relational goals. By the end of the chapter, she was immersed in the complexity of her emotions, poised between hesitation and the recognition of the significance of her response, fully aware that the decision to accept or decline would carry implications that could resonate far beyond the initial moment, shaping both his perception of her and the future path of their relationship. In the days following her decision to decline the invitation, a growing unease settled in her consciousness, compelling her to examine the motivations, fears, and assumptions that had guided her response. She reflected on the internal conflict that had arisen at the thought of meeting his parents, recognizing that the hesitation was rooted in layers of past experiences, social anxieties, and an ingrained tendency to seek control over unfamiliar situations. The act of saying no, which initially had felt like a minor assertion of personal boundaries, now revealed itself as a decision laden with consequences both anticipated and unforeseen. She began to notice the subtle shifts in her own thinking, the way moments of reflection brought into sharp relief the contrast between her internal reasoning and the external reality of relational impact. Each mental replay of her refusal highlighted potential interpretations from his perspective: disappointment, doubt, concern, and the subtle questioning of compatibility and commitment. She understood that relationships are constructed not only through shared experiences and positive interactions, but also through the cumulative effect of responses to moments of vulnerability, expectation, and social ritual. Her introspection revealed how easily one's intentions can diverge from perception, how a refusal framed by self-protection can be interpreted as disinterest or avoidance, and how relational dynamics are sensitive to the nuances of decision-making. Emotionally, she navigated a complex landscape of guilt, anxiety, and emergent empathy, recognizing that her comfort-driven choice had inadvertently introduced uncertainty into his perception of their shared future. She considered the potential ripple effects, his tentative confidence in their connection, the subtle questioning of her willingness to engage fully in partnership, and the possible erosion of trust and emotional security. Her reflection extended to an awareness of how minor decisions can compound over time, subtly shaping relational expectations, perceived alignment, and the overall trajectory of intimacy. She recognized patterns within herself: the inclination to prioritize immediate comfort over relational investment, the tendency to overanalyze potential discomforts, and the way avoidance can temporarily alleviate anxiety but often produces unintended relational strain. In parallel, she contemplated his perspective, imagining the mix of anticipation, vulnerability, and hope that accompanied his invitation, and how her refusal might have disrupted his sense of stability, partnership, and shared vision. This empathetic exercise deepened her understanding of the relational stakes and intensified the emotional gravity of her choice. She also began to explore the psychological mechanisms by which hesitation and avoidance can generate uncertainty, noting how even small acts of reluctance can seed questions about commitment, compatibility, and mutual priorities. The mental landscape was layered as she balanced acknowledgement of her own boundaries with recognition of the relational implications, attempting to reconcile the two in a framework of accountability, empathy, and foresight. Each reflection reinforced the delicate interplay between autonomy and connection, highlighting the necessity of integrating self-awareness, foresight, and relational sensitivity into decision-making processes. The chapter unfolded as a careful mapping of internal dialogue, emotional nuance, and anticipatory cognition, the recognition that personal choices resonate beyond the immediate context, influencing perception, trust, and the trajectory of shared life. By the conclusion of the stage of reflection, she had developed a sophisticated understanding of the subtle dynamics that had emerged from her refusal, the importance of awareness in relational decision-making, and the ways in which thoughtful engagement and intentional acknowledgement are critical for sustaining emotional security and mutual confidence in the partnership. The tension between personal boundaries and relational responsibility had crystallized into a clear, if uncomfortable, recognition that decisions, however small they may seem, carry weight, and that navigating these moments with consciousness, empathy, and foresight is essential to preserving connection and fostering clarity in the evolving path of their relationship. As the realization of the consequences of her refusal deepened, she began to perceive subtle shifts in his demeanor that reflected the growing uncertainty she had inadvertently introduced into their relationship. It was not dramatic or overt, rather, it was present in small hesitations, careful wording, and an almost imperceptible distance that contrasted with the warmth and openness that had characterized their interactions before. She observed these changes with a mixture of anxiety and introspection, tracing them back to her choice, understanding for the first time that what had seemed like a minor act of self-preservation had carried ramifications that extended far beyond the moment of refusal. Each interaction now carried a weight that had not been there before. Every casual conversation tinged with the unspoken awareness of relational tension, every planned activity shadowed by the subtle question of commitment and alignment. She reflected on the psychology of relational expectation, recognizing that milestones like meeting a partner's parents are laden with symbolic meaning. They convey trust, readiness, investment, and willingness to engage in shared life, and a refusal, even one rooted in caution or discomfort, can unintentionally cast doubt on these perceptions. Emotionally, she navigated a complex landscape, admiration for his patience, anxiety over the potential long-term consequences, and regret for failing to recognize the relational significance of the invitation in the first place. She began to reconstruct scenarios in her mind, considering what might have been conveyed through her refusal, how it might have been interpreted as disinterest, hesitation, or misalignment, and how this perception could influence his sense of stability and confidence in their future. In parallel, she analyzed her own internal response, noting how her desire for comfort and avoidance had momentarily overridden relational awareness, and how this prioritization, while instinctively protective, had introduced a subtle but consequential imbalance in their connection. She explored the dynamics of uncertainty, understanding that doubt is contagious. Once seated, it grows quietly, shaping perception, influencing behavior, and altering the emotional tone of interactions in ways that are not always immediately visible. Her reflections extended to the interplay between anticipation and disappointment, empathy and self-preservation, recognizing that human relationships are delicate structures in which small decisions can accumulate into significant emotional currents. She considered how he might be experiencing the situation, how he might interpret her refusal in the absence of explicit explanation or reassurance, and how relational confidence could erode quietly when expectations are unmet or boundaries are perceived as misaligned. This exercise in perspective-taking deepened her understanding of accountability, highlighting the responsibility inherent in relational choice and the necessity of conscious engagement with both one's own needs and the perceived expectations of the other. She examined the mechanisms of relational signaling, noting that actions, whether taken or declined, communicate meaning beyond the explicit, and that misalignment between intent and perception can produce uncertainty, tension, and subtle shifts in intimacy. Emotionally, she oscillated between remorse and resolve, acknowledging both her instinctive need for self-protection and the emerging awareness of the relational cost of avoidance. By the end of this period of reflection, she had developed a layered understanding of the delicate balance between personal boundaries and relational investment, recognizing that the act of saying no, while sometimes necessary, carries implications that extend into trust, perception, and shared future planning. The chapter concluded with the understanding that awareness alone was insufficient. It needed to be coupled with intentional communication, thoughtful expression, and proactive engagement to mitigate the uncertainty her refusal had introduced and to restore clarity, confidence, and emotional resonance within the relationship. The emotional weight of her decision had begun to settle more fully into her consciousness, creating a space in which reflection and reckoning intertwined. She found herself considering not only the immediate impact of declining the invitation, but also the cascading consequences it had generated in the relational dynamic between them. Each day brought renewed awareness of the subtle ways her refusal had influenced his perception: a quieter tone in conversation, a measured approach to planning, a hesitancy in sharing thoughts or expectations that had previously been met with ease and openness. She realized that while her intentions had been rooted in comfort, caution, or avoidance of anxiety, the result was a fissure in the sense of shared commitment that had once underpinned their interactions. Her internal dialogue became increasingly focused on the relational consequences, the ways in which trust, alignment, and mutual confidence had been subtly destabilized by what she had initially perceived as a minor decision. She explored the psychology of relational interpretation, understanding that humans are acutely sensitive to signals of willingness, engagement, and investment, and that even small acts of reluctance can introduce doubt, uncertainty, and emotional distance. Emotionally, she navigated a complex landscape oscillating between guilt, regret, and the emergent desire to repair the subtle damage her decision had caused. She considered the nature of milestones and symbolic acts within relationships, recognizing that invitations such as meeting a partner's family carry layered meanings, conveying trust, commitment, and readiness to integrate into each other's lives. Her refusal, however practical or self-protective, had interrupted this symbolic continuity, introducing ambiguity and prompting him to reassess the trajectory of their connection. In examining her own internal patterns, she identified a tension between self-preservation and relational investment, noting how habitual avoidance had, in the past, shielded her from discomfort while simultaneously limiting intimacy and shared growth. She reflected on the ripple effect of her actions, tracing how the initial refusal had subtly influenced subsequent interactions, emotional tone, and unspoken expectations. Each recollection reinforced the insight that relational dynamics are cumulative, that small decisions have broader implications, and that awareness of these consequences is essential for sustaining trust and emotional stability. She began to contemplate strategies for addressing the uncertainty, understanding that reconciliation required both acknowledgement of the impact of her actions and proactive steps to rebuild alignment and confidence. Her thoughts turned to communication: how to express awareness of the significance of the invitation, how to convey respect for his intentions, and how to demonstrate willingness to engage with the milestones he valued. She explored the emotional labor inherent in repair, recognizing that bridging the gap between her intentions and his perceptions demanded vulnerability, empathy, and careful articulation. In parallel, she considered the broader lessons embedded in the experience: the importance of integrating personal boundaries with relational sensitivity, the recognition that timing and context influence interpretation, and the necessity of translating awareness into tangible action to prevent lingering doubt or disengagement. By the end of this period of reflection, she had developed a more sophisticated understanding of the dynamics at play: how avoidance, even when motivated by self-protection, can introduce uncertainty, how acknowledgement and proactive engagement serve as corrective mechanisms, and how conscious attention to relational cues and symbolic milestones is essential for maintaining emotional security and shared confidence. The chapter closed with the realization that the path forward required deliberate, thoughtful action, a commitment to bridging perception and intention, and the cultivation of both awareness and expression to restore trust, alignment, and clarity within the evolving relationship. With the growing awareness of the impact of her refusal, she began to actively contemplate ways to repair the subtle rift that had formed between them. The initial discomfort she had felt gave way to a purposeful engagement with the emotional and relational work necessary to restore trust and clarity. She reflected on how small, deliberate acts could communicate recognition of the significance of his invitation, acknowledging not only the missed opportunity but also the deeper meanings it carried: commitment, readiness, and the desire to integrate their lives more fully. Each potential action was carefully weighed for authenticity, timing, and emotional resonance, as she recognized that superficial gestures would fail to bridge the emotional gap and might even exacerbate uncertainty. She considered verbal acknowledgement, written communication, and thoughtful gestures that could demonstrate both understanding and sincere effort to reconnect. The challenge lay in translating internal insight into external expression, in moving from awareness of the relational impacts to tangible behaviors that would reassure him and reestablish confidence in their shared path. She reflected on the importance of empathy, attempting to perceive the situation through his perspective, the hopes, expectations, and emotional vulnerability that accompanied the invitation, and the subtle disappointment that may have arisen from her refusal. This exercise deepened her understanding of relational sensitivity, revealing how awareness of another's emotional landscape is crucial in navigating moments of tension or uncertainty. She also considered her own boundaries and the ways in which assertiveness and self-care could coexist with relational responsiveness, recognizing that repair does not require sacrificing personal comfort but does demand conscious effort to honor shared commitments and milestones. Each day of reflection reinforced the interconnectedness of perception, behavior, and trust, highlighting how deliberate acknowledgement could mitigate doubt and restore relational equilibrium. She analyzed past relational experiences, observing patterns in which avoidance or hesitation had introduced uncertainty and how proactive engagement had previously strengthened bonds. These insights informed her emerging strategies for repair, emphasizing transparency, humility, and consistency in demonstrating recognition of his care, investment, and expectations. Emotionally, she experienced a complex blend of hope, vulnerability, and determination, understanding that while the initial discomfort had been protective, the long-term implications necessitated courage and proactive engagement. She visualized the trajectory of their interactions, imagining scenarios where acknowledgement, empathy, and thoughtful gestures could gradually rebuild confidence, reduce doubt, and reestablish a sense of alignment in their shared future. Each reflection underscored the importance of intention in relational behavior, that awareness alone is insufficient, that meaningful action is required to convey understanding and respect, and that repair is an iterative, ongoing process rather than a single corrective event. By the end of this stage, she had developed a structured plan of relational engagement, conscious acknowledgement of her previous hesitation, articulation of understanding regarding its impact, and consistent demonstration of willingness to participate in shared milestones moving forward. The chapter concluded with a recognition of the delicate interplay between personal boundaries, relational expectations, and emotional responsibility, emphasizing that proactive effort, sincere communication, and empathetic awareness are essential to bridging the gap created by hesitation and to fostering enduring trust, intimacy, and alignment in the evolving trajectory of their partnership. By the final stage of reflection, she had moved from awareness and contemplation to the urgent necessity of integrating insight into meaningful action. The realization of how her refusal to meet his parents had affected his perception and introduced uncertainty into their relationship had crystallized into a deep understanding of responsibility, empathy, and relational foresight. She examined the intricate web of consequences that arose from what had initially seemed like a minor decision, recognizing that relational dynamics are highly sensitive to signals of engagement, trust, and willingness to participate in shared life milestones. Each gesture, conversation, or expression of acknowledgement became a potential bridge, a way to reestablish confidence and emotional resonance. She considered the subtle cues he might be sending, the restrained enthusiasm, the careful phrasing, the moments of hesitation, and understood that these were reflections of his own processing, interpretations, and perhaps doubts. In response, she mapped out a path toward restoration, focusing on authentic, deliberate actions that could convey not only recognition of the missed opportunity but also commitment to their shared future. Her thoughts encompassed verbal acknowledgement, affirming conversations, and meaningful gestures designed to communicate her awareness, understanding, and care. She reflected on timing, noting that expressions of recognition must be timely to be most effective, balancing the need to respect his emotional processing with the necessity of demonstrating sincerity and attentiveness. Emotionally, she navigated vulnerability, the discomfort of admitting oversight, and the courage required to approach him with transparency and intentionality. She understood that relational repair is iterative, No single act could fully resolve the tension, but a consistent pattern of acknowledgement and engagement could gradually rebuild trust, intimacy, and alignment. The chapter explored the delicate interplay between personal boundaries and relational responsibility, highlighting that acting with awareness does not necessitate sacrificing autonomy but does require sensitivity to the emotional stakes inherent in shared life milestones. She recognized that every interaction following the refusal carried potential for recalibration, each carefully considered response, each demonstration of understanding, and each step toward participation in shared experiences could reinforce the strength of their connection and mitigate the uncertainty introduced by her initial hesitation. She contemplated the broader lessons of the experience, understanding that human relationships are complex systems in which minor decisions can cascade into significant emotional effects, that acknowledgement and proactive engagement serve as corrective mechanisms, and that empathy and attentiveness are essential to sustaining trust and alignment. Her reflections emphasize that growth and repair are processes requiring ongoing mindfulness, deliberate action, and a commitment to bridging perception and intention. By the close of the stage, she had internalized a nuanced understanding of the relational landscape. Awareness alone is insufficient. Action, sincerity, and consistency are essential to restore confidence and emotional resonance. She felt a renewed determination to honor the milestones, expectations, and emotional investments of both partners, integrating her own boundaries with the needs of the relationship. The chapter concluded with the recognition that true relational resilience emerges from conscious engagement, the willingness to acknowledge impact, and the disciplined practice of translating insight into meaningful, ongoing behaviors that reinforce connection, clarity, and mutual trust in the evolving trajectory of their partnership.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.